The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle like whispered secrets from centuries past. Sergeant James Morrison had been walking these corridors for 15 years, his polished boots echoing against marble floors that had witnessed the rise and fall of monarchs. At 42, he possessed the quiet dignity that came with serving the crown, his uniform pressed to perfection, his bearing straight as the Tower of London's walls. Today felt different. Perhaps it was the way the autumn light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the Persian rugs, or maybe it was the unusual silence that seemed to permeate the royal quarters. The Queen Consort was away in Scotland, attending a charity event for literacy programs, leaving her private apartments temporarily under heightened security protocols. Morrison adjusted his ceremonial sword and continued his rounds. The palace had been buzzing with preparations for the upcoming state banquet, and security had been doubled following recent intelligence reports about potential threats. Every room, every closet, every hidden alcove needed to be thoroughly inspected before the Queen Consort's return. He approached the ornate doors leading to Camilla's private chambers. The brass handles, polished to a mirror's shine, bore the intricate coat of arms that spoke of centuries of royal tradition. Morrison had been specifically assigned to conduct the security sweep of these rooms, a responsibility he didn't take lightly. The trust placed in him by his superiors was something he cherished deeply. The sitting room greeted him with its familiar elegance. Cream-colored walls adorned with portraits of royal ancestors gazed down at him with painted eyes that seemed to follow his movement. Fresh flowers from the castle gardens filled crystal vases, their fragrance mixing with the subtle scent of beeswax polish that the housekeeping staff used on the antique furniture. Morrison methodically checked behind each piece of furniture, under cushions, and around the grand piano that stood majestically in the corner. The Queen Consort was known for her love of music, often playing pieces by Bach and Chopin during quiet evening hours. He ran his hands along the piano's legs, checking for anything unusual before moving toward the bedroom. The bedroom exuded warmth and sophistication. The four-poster bed, draped in rich burgundy silk, dominated the space. Family photographs in silver frames dotted the side tables, capturing moments of joy and celebration from royal engagements and private family gatherings. Morrison's trained eyes scanned every surface, every shadow, every potential hiding place. It was when he approached the walk-in wardrobe that his pulse quickened slightly. This wasn't nervousness. Morrison had nerves of steel, but rather the heightened awareness that came with approaching the most private space of a royal residence. The wardrobe was enormous, stretching nearly 20 feet in length and divided into sections for different types of clothing. The electronic security panel beside the wardrobe door blinked green, indicating that the space had been secured. Morrison entered his access code, hearing the soft click as the lock disengaged. The heavy door swung open silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing a space that resembled a high-end boutique more than a simple closet. Rows of evening gowns hung in perfect alignment, their rich fabrics catching the soft LED lighting installed throughout the wardrobe. Shelves lined with handbags, shoes, and jewelry boxes created an organized display of luxury. The scent of cedar and lavender sachets filled the air, protecting the precious garments from moths and moisture. Morrison began his systematic inspection, carefully moving aside garments to check behind them. His hands were gentle but thorough, mindful that each dress, each coat, each accessory represented not just enormous monetary value but also held significance in the royal family's public image. He had seen the Queen Consort wear many of these pieces at state functions and charity events, each appearance carefully planned and executed. The inspection was proceeding routinely until Morrison reached the far end of the wardrobe, where a section was separated by a heavy velvet curtain. Behind this curtain hung what appeared to be the most formal and ceremonial pieces of the Queen Consort's collection. Ball gowns with intricate beadwork, ceremonial robes with elaborate embroidery, and formal wear reserved for the most significant state occasions. As Morrison carefully parted the garments to inspect behind them, his flashlight beam caught something unexpected. Tucked away in the very back corner, almost hidden behind a particularly voluminous evening gown, hung a garment that made him pause. Even in the dim light, he could see that this piece was different from the others. The fabric seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality, and the craftsmanship appeared to be of a level beyond even the exquisite pieces that surrounded it. Morrison stepped closer, his heart rate increasing despite his professional composure. As he carefully moved the concealing gown aside, the full majesty of the hidden garment was revealed. What he saw made him catch his breath, his years of training momentarily forgotten in the face of what lay before him. The robe was magnificent beyond description. Crafted from the finest silk in a deep royal purple that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously, it was adorned with intricate gold embroidery that depicted the symbols of British monarchy. Crowns, scepters, lions, and unicorns danced across the fabric in threads so fine they seemed painted rather than sewn. Along the edges, what appeared to be genuine ermine trim created a border of pristine white fur. But it wasn't just the extraordinary beauty of the garment that made Morrison's hands tremble slightly as he reached for his radio. It was the recognition that was dawning on him, the impossible realization of what he was looking at. This wasn't just any ceremonial robe. The specific combination of symbols, the particular shade of purple, the distinctive pattern of the embroidery, all of these elements pointed to one stunning conclusion. Morrison had seen this robe before, not in person, but in photographs and video footage that had been broadcast around the world. He had been just a young man at the time, but the images had been seared into the collective memory of the British people and millions of viewers worldwide. This robe, unless he was gravely mistaken, was the coronation robe worn by Queen Elizabeth II on June 2, 1953, during her coronation at Westminster Abbey. The significance of this discovery hit Morrison like a physical blow. The late Queen's coronation robe was supposed to be in the Tower of London, carefully preserved with the other crown jewels and royal regalia. It was one of the most precious artifacts in British history, worn during one of the most important ceremonies of the 20th century. What was it doing here, hidden in the Queen Consort's private wardrobe? Morrison's training kicked in, overriding his shock and confusion. He carefully replaced the concealing gown, ensuring that the scene looked exactly as he had found it. His mind raced through the protocols for such a discovery. Who should he contact first? His immediate supervisor? The palace security chief? The implications of what he had found were staggering, and he knew that his next actions would be crucial. He backed away from the wardrobe slowly, his eyes never leaving the spot where the robe was concealed. The silence of the room now felt oppressive, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Morrison realized that he had stumbled upon something that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. As he stood in the Queen Consort's bedroom, surrounded by the luxury and tradition of royal life, Morrison felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. He was no longer just a royal guard conducting a routine security sweep. He had become an unwitting participant in what could become one of the most significant royal scandals in modern British history. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting new shadows across the room as Morrison wrestled with his discovery. He knew that once he reported what he had found, there would be no going back. The secret he now carried would have to be shared, investigated, and ultimately explained. The peaceful routine of palace life was about to be shattered, and Morrison was the man who would be responsible for dropping the stone that created the ripples. He thought about the Queen Consort, currently hundreds of miles away in Scotland, unaware that her most private space had just yielded its extraordinary secret. He thought about the late Queen Elizabeth, whose memory was still fresh in the minds of the British people, and how this discovery might impact her legacy. Most of all, he thought about his duty as a royal guard, sworn to protect not just the physical safety of the royal family, but also the institution of the monarchy itself. Morrison finally reached for his secure radio, his finger hovering over the transmission button. In a few moments, he would speak words that would set in motion a chain of events beyond his imagination. The discovery of Queen Elizabeth's coronation robe in Camilla's wardrobe would soon become the most closely guarded secret in the palace, and Morrison would find himself at the center of a royal mystery that would test the very bonds of the House of Windsor. The radio crackled to life as Morrison made his decision. The secret was too significant to bear alone, and duty demanded that he report his findings. As he prepared to speak, the afternoon light continued to fade, and the shadows in the room grew longer, as if darkness itself was gathering to witness what would happen next. "Control, this is Sergeant Morrison," he said quietly into the radio, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to report. "I need to speak with the Chief of Security immediately. We have a situation that requires urgent attention." The response came back instantly, the voice on the other end noting the unusual tone in Morrison's normally calm demeanor. "Roger that, Sergeant. Stand by for immediate connection to Chief Henderson." As Morrison waited for the connection, he took one last look around the Queen Consort's private chamber. Everything looked exactly the same as when he had entered, yet everything had changed. The room now held a secret that could alter the course of royal history, and Morrison was the only person in the world who knew it. The discovery had been made. Now the real story would begin. Chief Security Officer Margaret Henderson had served the royal household for 28 years, rising through the ranks with a combination of intelligence, discretion, and unwavering loyalty. At 55, she commanded respect from everyone in the palace, from the newest guards to the senior courtiers. When the urgent message from Sergeant Morrison reached her, she was reviewing security protocols for the upcoming state visit from the Japanese emperor. Nothing in her extensive experience had prepared her for what Morrison was about to reveal. Henderson arrived at the Queen Consort's chambers within 10 minutes of Morrison's call, accompanied by Deputy Chief Thomas Whitfield, a former Scotland Yard detective whose expertise in sensitive investigations had made him invaluable to the palace security team. The two senior officers found Morrison standing guard outside the bedroom door, his posture rigid with tension. "Sergeant Morrison," Henderson said, her voice carrying the authority of decades of service. "Your message was somewhat cryptic. What exactly have you discovered?" Morrison's usual composure was intact, but Henderson could see the strain in his eyes. In all their years of working together, she had never seen him quite like this. "Ma'am, I believe it would be better if I showed you rather than attempted to explain. What I've found requires immediate verification and discretion." Whitfield raised an eyebrow. In his years of investigating sensitive matters for the Crown, he had learned to read between the lines when security personnel spoke in such careful terms. "Lead the way, Sergeant. We're prepared for whatever you've uncovered." The trio entered the Queen Consort's bedroom, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Henderson noted that Morrison had been careful to preserve the scene exactly as he had found it, a testament to his professionalism. They approached the walk-in wardrobe, where Morrison paused before the entrance. "Ma'am, before we proceed, I need to stress that what I'm about to show you has implications that go far beyond a simple security matter. This discovery could have significant ramifications for the royal family and the monarchy as an institution." Henderson and Whitfield exchanged glances. In their combined 40-plus years of service to the Crown, they had handled state secrets, family scandals, and security threats that could have destabilized governments. Morrison's grave tone suggested that this discovery ranked among the most serious situations they had ever encountered. They followed Morrison into the wardrobe, where he led them to the far end, behind the velvet curtain that separated the most formal garments from the rest. With careful, almost reverent movements, Morrison parted the concealing evening gown to reveal the hidden robe. Henderson's sharp intake of breath was audible in the silence. Whitfield, who had maintained his composure through investigations involving international conspiracies and terrorist threats, found himself speechless for the first time in years. Before them hung what appeared to be one of the most significant artifacts in British royal history. "Dear God," Henderson whispered, her professional demeanor momentarily forgotten. "Is that what I think it is?" Whitfield stepped closer, his detective's eye automatically cataloging every detail of the garment. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, far beyond anything typically found in contemporary royal wardrobes. The silk seemed to glow in the wardrobe's lighting, and the gold embroidery was so intricate it appeared to be the work of master craftsmen from another era. "The Coronation Robe," Whitfield said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that's impossible. The late Queen's coronation regalia is supposed to be in the Tower of London, under maximum security." Henderson felt her mind racing through the implications of this discovery. If this was indeed Queen Elizabeth II's coronation robe, its presence in Camilla's private wardrobe raised questions that struck at the heart of royal protocol and tradition. How had it come to be here? When had it been moved? And, most importantly, who had authorized its transfer? "Sergeant Morrison," Henderson said, her voice regaining its professional edge, "I want you to seal this wardrobe immediately. No one else enters this room until we've conducted a full investigation. Deputy Chief Whitfield, I need you to discreetly verify the location of the coronation regalia that's supposed to be in the tower. We need to know if this is the original or if there are two robes." Whitfield nodded grimly. "I'll contact the keeper of the crown jewels immediately. But, Margaret, if this is what we think it is, we're looking at a situation that could scandal the monarchy beyond anything we've faced in recent memory." Henderson understood the gravity of what Whitfield was suggesting. The coronation robe wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a sacred artifact that connected the current monarchy to centuries of tradition. Its unauthorized presence in a private wardrobe could suggest everything from innocent family sentiment to something far more troubling. Over the next several hours, Henderson coordinated the most discreet investigation in her career. The inquiry had to be conducted with absolute secrecy while still being thorough enough to uncover the truth. She assembled a small team of the most trusted security personnel, each sworn to confidentiality under the Official Secrets Act. The first breakthrough came when Whitfield returned from his contact with the Tower of London. Dr. Edmund Carlyle, the keeper of the crown jewels, had been initially confused by Whitfield's careful inquiries about the coronation regalia. When pressed for specific details about the robe's location and condition, Dr. Carlyle had admitted something troubling. The coronation robe has been in restricted storage for the past 18 months, Whitfield reported to Henderson in her secure office. Dr. Carlyle says it was removed for conservation work at the request of the royal household. He assumed it was being restored by the Royal Collection Trust's textile experts. Henderson felt a chill run down her spine. Conservation work ordered by whom? That's where it gets interesting, Whitfield continued. The authorization came through proper channels, but Dr. Carlyle admits he never followed up to confirm the work was completed. The robe was collected by a specialist courier service that handles royal artifacts, but there's no record of it being returned. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture that Henderson found deeply troubling. Someone with sufficient authority and knowledge of palace protocols had arranged for the removal of one of the crown's most precious artifacts. The question was whether this had been done with legitimate intentions or for reasons that could prove embarrassing or worse for the royal family. Henderson decided it was time to examine the robe more closely. She arranged for Dr. Sarah Pemberton, the Royal Collection Trust's chief textile conservator, to conduct a discreet examination. Dr. Pemberton was known for her discretion and expertise in analyzing historical royal garments. Dr. Pemberton arrived at the palace late that evening, carrying a portable analysis kit that would allow her to examine the fabric and embroidery without removing the robe from its location. Henderson and Whitfield watched as the expert carefully studied every aspect of the garment using specialized lighting and magnification equipment. The silk is definitely from the early 1950s, Dr. Pemberton reported as she worked. The weaving technique and the particular shade of purple are consistent with fabrics available during that period. The gold thread in the embroidery is genuine, and the quality of workmanship is extraordinary. She continued her examination, paying particular attention to the areas where the robe would have shown the most wear during the coronation ceremony. There are microscopic traces of wear patterns that would be consistent with the garment being worn for several hours during a formal ceremony. The positioning of these wear marks matches what we would expect to see on the actual coronation robe. Henderson and Whitfield exchanged meaningful looks. Dr. Pemberton's analysis was confirming their worst fears. This appeared to be the genuine article, not a replica or costume piece. Dr. Pemberton, Henderson asked carefully, in your expert opinion, is this the actual coronation robe worn by Queen Elizabeth II? The textile expert paused in her examination, understanding the weight of her words. Based on my analysis of the fabric, construction techniques, or patterns, and materials used, I would say with 95% certainty that this is indeed the original coronation robe. The remaining 5% of doubt comes only from the fact that I cannot account for how it came to be in this location. After Dr. Pemberton left with strict instructions to maintain absolute confidentiality, Henderson and Whitfield faced the reality of their situation. They had confirmed that Queen Elizabeth II's coronation robe was hidden in Queen Consort Camilla's private wardrobe, far from its supposed secure location in the Tower of London. The next morning brought additional, disturbing revelations. Henderson's investigation into the courier service that had collected the robe revealed that while the company was legitimate and did indeed handle royal artifacts, their records for the transportation of the coronation robe contained irregularities. The pickup was authorized by someone in the Queen Consort's office, Henderson reported to Whitfield during their morning briefing. But when I contacted that office, they claimed to have no record of requesting the robe's removal for conservation work. Whitfield rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. So we have an unauthorized removal of one of the crown's most precious artifacts, conflicting records about who requested the removal, and the robe turning up in the Queen Consort's private wardrobe. Margaret, this has all the hallmarks of a major security breach. Henderson nodded grimly. Or worse, we need to consider the possibility that someone in the royal household arranged for the robe to be moved without proper authorization. The question is whether this was done innocently or with more troubling motives. The investigation was revealing a complex web of authorizations, protocols, and procedures that someone had either circumvented or manipulated. Henderson realized that they were dealing with someone who had intimate knowledge of how the royal household operated and sufficient authority to move freely within palace security systems. As the second day of investigation drew to a close, Henderson made the decision that she had been dreading. The scope of the discovery and its potential implications meant that she could no longer handle this matter within her security team alone. The situation required the involvement of senior palace officials who could provide guidance on the delicate balance between investigating potential wrongdoing and protecting the monarchy from scandal. She placed a secure call to Sir Anthony Hartwell, the private secretary to the king, requesting an urgent and confidential meeting. Sir Anthony, a veteran of royal service who had navigated numerous crises during his career, agreed to meet Henderson the following morning. That night, Henderson lay awake in her apartment near the palace, staring at the ceiling as she contemplated the magnitude of what they had uncovered. In 48 hours, what had started as a routine security sweep had evolved into an investigation that could potentially embarrass the royal family and raise questions about the security of the crown's most precious artifacts. She thought about Sergeant Morrison, whose diligent performance of his duties had uncovered this situation. She thought about the Queen Consort, currently in Scotland and unaware that her private wardrobe had become the center of a royal investigation. Most of all, she thought about Queen Elizabeth II, whose memory and legacy could be affected by whatever explanation emerged for how her coronation robe had ended up hidden away in a private wardrobe. Henderson realized that the investigation was entering a new phase, one that would require careful navigation of royal sensitivities while still pursuing the truth. The discovery of the coronation robe had opened questions that demanded answers, but those answers might prove more disturbing than anyone in the palace was prepared to handle. As dawn approached over Windsor Castle, Henderson prepared herself for what promised to be one of the most challenging days of her career. The meeting with Sir Anthony would determine whether the investigation expanded to include senior royal officials or whether the matter would be handled with the kind of discretion that sometimes characterized royal scandals. Whatever the decision, Henderson knew that the discovery in Camilla's wardrobe had already changed everything. The secret was no longer contained within her security team, and the implications of the coronation robe's mysterious presence were about to reach the highest levels of the royal household. Sir Anthony Hartwell had served as private secretary to the king for 8 years, having previously held the same position under Queen Elizabeth II during the final decade of her reign. At 63, he possessed the rare combination of institutional memory and diplomatic skill that made him indispensable during royal crises. When Chief Henderson's urgent request for a confidential meeting reached him, Sir Anthony knew that whatever she had discovered was serious enough to potentially threaten the stability of the monarchy. The meeting took place in Sir Anthony's private office within Buckingham Palace, a room lined with portraits of former monarchs and filled with the quiet authority that came with centuries of royal service. Henderson arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, carrying a sealed briefcase containing photographs and documentation from her investigation. "Margaret," Sir Anthony said, gesturing for her to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Your message suggested this matter requires the highest level of discretion. In my experience, such situations rarely have simple explanations." Henderson opened her briefcase and placed several photographs on Sir Anthony's desk. The images, taken with specialized lighting to capture every detail, showed the coronation robe in all its magnificent detail. Sir Anthony studied the photographs with growing concern, his experienced eye immediately recognizing the significance of what he was seeing. "Sir Anthony, 3 days ago, Sergeant Morrison discovered this robe hidden in Queen Consort Camilla's private wardrobe during a routine security sweep," Henderson began, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. "Our investigation has confirmed that this is almost certainly the actual coronation robe worn by Queen Elizabeth II, which was supposedly in secure storage at the Tower of London." Sir Anthony set down the photographs and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the implications of Henderson's revelation. In his decades of service to the crown, he had dealt with scandals involving royal marriages, financial irregularities, and security breaches, but nothing that potentially involved the unauthorized possession of sacred royal regalia. "Have you determined how the robe came to be in the Queen Consort's possession?" Sir Anthony asked, his voice carefully neutral. Henderson proceeded to brief him on every aspect of their investigation: the mysterious authorization for conservation work, the courier service with conflicting records, and the lack of any official documentation explaining the robe's presence in Camilla's wardrobe. Sir Anthony listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. Sir Anthony, we're facing a situation where one of the crown's most precious artifacts has been moved without proper authorization and is currently in the private possession of a member of the royal family. The implications for palace security and royal protocol are significant. Sir Anthony stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, where tourists gathered daily to catch glimpses of royal life. He understood that the wrong handling of this situation could lead to a scandal that would dominate headlines worldwide and potentially damage the monarchy's reputation. Margaret, before we proceed further, I need to make some discreet inquiries of my own. This matter touches on issues that go beyond security protocols. There may be aspects of this situation that require careful consideration from a family perspective as well as an institutional one. Over the following 24 hours, Sir Anthony conducted his own investigation through channels available only to someone of his position and authority. He spoke confidentially with senior courtiers who had served during the late Queen's final years, palace staff members who had access to royal wardrobes, and officials responsible for managing the royal collection. What Sir Anthony discovered during his inquiries painted a more complex picture than even Henderson's thorough investigation had revealed. The story that emerged involved family sentiment, royal tradition, and decisions made during the emotional period following Queen Elizabeth's death. Sir Anthony learned that in the weeks following the Queen's passing, Camilla had been devastated by the loss of the woman who had eventually become not just her mother-in-law, but a close confidant. Despite the initial difficulties in their relationship, the two women had developed a genuine affection for each other during Camilla's years as the then Prince of Wales's wife. According to Lady Patricia Westbrook, one of Camilla's longtime companions and confidants, the Queen Consort had been deeply moved by a private conversation she had with Queen Elizabeth just weeks before the monarch's death. During that conversation, the dying queen had expressed her hope that Camilla would carry forward the traditions and dignity of the monarchy. Her Majesty told the Queen Consort that she believed Camilla understood the weight of royal duty in a way that would serve the crown well. Lady Patricia had confided to Sir Anthony. The Queen was particularly pleased with how the Queen Consort had handled her role during the Diamond Jubilee celebrations and other significant events. Sir Anthony's inquiries also revealed that following the Queen's death, Camilla had made an informal request to have access to some of Elizabeth's personal items as a way of maintaining a connection to her predecessor's memory. This request had been handled through unofficial channels, with palace staff members trying to accommodate the grieving Queen Consort's wishes during an emotionally difficult period. The picture that emerged suggested that the Coronation Robe's presence in Camilla's wardrobe might have been the result of well-intentioned but improperly executed efforts to provide comfort to the Queen Consort during her period of mourning. However, the unauthorized nature of the transfer still represented a serious breach of protocol that could not be ignored. Sir Anthony's investigation also uncovered evidence that several other items belonging to Queen Elizabeth had been quietly transferred to Camilla's possession during the same period. These included personal jewelry pieces, handwritten notes, and small mementos that the late Queen had used regularly. While these transfers were more easily understood from a family perspective, they had all been conducted without the proper documentation required for movements of royal property. When Sir Anthony met with Henderson again to share his findings, both officials recognized that they were dealing with a situation that existed in the gray area between family sentiment and institutional protocol. The Queen Consort's possession of her predecessor's items could be viewed as either touching tribute or serious breach of procedure, depending on one's perspective. Margaret, what we're dealing with appears to be the result of grief-induced decisions made during an exceptionally emotional period, Sir Anthony explained. However, the improper nature of these transfers means we cannot simply ignore what has occurred. Henderson nodded, understanding the delicate balance that Sir Anthony was trying to maintain. Sir Anthony, regardless of the motivations involved, we have a situation where sacred royal regalia was moved without authorization. From a security standpoint, this represents a significant breach that could be repeated with more serious consequences. The two senior officials spent hours discussing potential approaches to resolving the situation. They needed to address the security breach while being sensitive to the family dynamics involved. They also had to consider the potential for public scandal if news of the discovery became known outside the palace. Sir Anthony made the decision to approach King Charles III directly. As both Camilla's husband and the head of the royal family, The king needed to be informed about the discovery and given the opportunity to address the situation personally. However, Sir Anthony was careful to frame the discussion in terms that emphasized the family aspect of the situation rather than treating it as a criminal investigation. The meeting with King Charles took place in his private study at Highgrove House, where the monarch had retreated for a few days of relative privacy. Sir Anthony chose this location deliberately, knowing that the informal setting would allow for a more personal conversation than would be possible in the formal atmosphere of Buckingham Palace. King Charles listened carefully as Sir Anthony explained the discovery of the coronation robe and the investigation that had followed. The king's reaction was complex, reflecting both concern about the breach of protocol and understanding of his wife's emotional state following his mother's death. "Anthony, my wife was profoundly affected by my mother's passing," the king said, his voice carrying the weight of personal grief as well as royal responsibility. In the months following the funeral, Camilla struggled with feelings that she had somehow failed to measure up to my mother's example. "I believe her desire to maintain a connection to my mother's memory was entirely innocent." Sir Anthony nodded respectfully, but pressed the king to understand the institutional implications of what had occurred. "Your Majesty, while the Queen Consort's motivations may have been entirely pure, the unauthorized transfer of the coronation robe represents a serious breach of protocol that could have significant consequences if it becomes public knowledge." The king understood the delicate position in which the palace found itself. On one hand, his wife's actions, while technically improper, had been motivated by love and respect for his mother's memory. On the other hand, the breach of protocol regarding such an important royal artifact could not be ignored without potentially encouraging similar breaches in the future. Over the following week, a carefully orchestrated plan was developed to address the situation. The coronation robe would be quietly returned to its proper place in the Tower of London, with documentation created to show that the conservation work had been completed. The other items that had been transferred to Camilla's possession would be properly catalogued and, where appropriate, formally gifted to her through the correct legal channels. However, the most delicate aspect of the resolution involved addressing the matter with Queen Consort Camilla herself. The king insisted on handling this conversation personally, understanding that his wife would be mortified to learn that her private actions had caused such concern within the palace hierarchy. The conversation between King Charles and Queen Consort Camilla took place upon her return from Scotland. Sir Anthony was not present for this private family discussion, but the king later reported that Camilla had been devastated to learn that her possession of the robe had been discovered and investigated. "She genuinely had no understanding that what she had done was improper," the king told Sir Anthony. "In her mind, she was simply maintaining a connection to my mother's memory. The idea that this could be seen as theft or improper conduct was genuinely shocking to her." Camilla's reaction, according to the king, had been immediate remorse and a desire to make things right. She had been particularly distressed to learn that her actions had put palace staff members in difficult positions and had potentially compromised the security protocols that protected royal artifacts. The resolution of the situation required careful coordination between multiple palace departments. The coronation robe was discreetly transported back to the Tower of London during a routine exchange of artifacts between royal collections. Dr. Carlyle, the keeper of the crown jewels, was briefed on the situation and agreed to maintain confidentiality while ensuring that proper protocols were reinforced for future conservation work. Sergeant Morrison, whose diligent performance of his duties had uncovered the situation, received a commendation for his professionalism and discretion. However, he was also required to sign additional confidentiality agreements acknowledging the sensitive nature of his discovery. Chief Henderson implemented new protocols for the handling of royal artifacts and the documentation required for their movement between royal properties. These new procedures were designed to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future while maintaining the appropriate level of access for legitimate conservation and family purposes. The Queen Consort, for her part, made a private donation to the Royal Collection Trust to fund enhanced security measures for the protection of royal artifacts. While this donation was never publicly announced, it represented her personal acknowledgement of the seriousness of what had occurred and her commitment to ensuring that such breaches of protocol would not happen again. As the immediate crisis was resolved, Sir Anthony reflected on the complex nature of royal service. The discovery of the coronation robe had revealed the tension that existed between the monarchy as a family and the monarchy as an institution. While the situation had been handled discreetly and appropriately, It had also highlighted the need for clearer protocols regarding the handling of royal property during periods of emotional stress and family transition. The secret of the Coronation Robe's temporary residence in Camilla's wardrobe remained closely guarded among the small group of individuals who had been involved in its discovery and resolution. However, the incident had lasting effects on palace procedures and served as a reminder that even the most well-intentioned actions could have serious consequences when they involved the crown's most precious artifacts. 3 months after the Coronation Robe incident had been quietly resolved, a new crisis emerged that threatened to expose everything the palace had worked so carefully to conceal. The trouble began with an unexpected source, a routine audit of the Royal Collection Trust's insurance policies that revealed discrepancies in the documentation of several precious artifacts. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, a meticulous insurance assessor with 25 years of experience in evaluating high-value historical items, had been contracted to review the trust's coverage of coronation regalia and state ceremonial items. Her job was to ensure that insurance valuations matched current market assessments and that all items were properly documented and accounted for. When Mrs. Fitzpatrick requested access to examine the Coronation Robe as part of her assessment, Dr. Carlyle at the Tower of London found himself in an impossible position. The robe had indeed been returned to its proper location, but the hastily created documentation to explain its temporary absence contained inconsistencies that a professional assessor would certainly notice. The conservation records showed work periods that didn't align with the Royal Collection Trust's official conservation schedule. The transportation documents contained authorization signatures from officials who claimed no knowledge of the work orders. Most problematically, the returned robe showed no evidence of the extensive conservation work that the paperwork claimed had been performed. Dr. Carlyle contacted Sir Anthony immediately, explaining that Mrs. Fitzpatrick's audit was threatening to expose the entire cover-up. "Sir Anthony, this assessor is asking questions that I cannot answer without either lying outright or revealing what actually occurred. She's noticed that the conservation documentation doesn't match the robe's current condition." Sir Anthony felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. The careful resolution they had orchestrated was beginning to unravel, and the involvement of an outside contractor meant that the circle of people aware of discrepancies was expanding beyond their control. Mrs. Fitzpatrick's preliminary report, submitted to the Royal Collection Trust's board, raised red flags about the Coronation Robe's recent history. While she stopped short of making accusations, her professional assessment noted irregularities in documentation and condition reports that warrant further investigation. The board of the Royal Collection Trust, which included several peers and distinguished academics, took Mrs. Fitzpatrick's concerns seriously. They requested a full audit of the robe's handling over the past 2 years, including detailed interviews with everyone involved in its conservation and transportation. This development created a nightmare scenario for Sir Anthony and the palace hierarchy. A formal audit would inevitably uncover the truth about the robe's unauthorized presence in Camilla's wardrobe, and the involvement of outside board members made it impossible to simply suppress the investigation. Meanwhile, other consequences of the original incident were beginning to surface. Palace staff members who had been involved in facilitating the transfer of the Queen's personal items to Camilla were growing increasingly uncomfortable with the deception they had been asked to maintain. Several staff members approached their union representatives, concerned about potential legal liability for their roles in moving royal property without proper authorization. Agnes Murphy, a senior housekeeping supervisor who had worked at the palace for 18 years, was particularly troubled. She had personally supervised the packing and transfer of several items from Queen Elizabeth's private quarters to Camilla's rooms, believing at the time that this was being done with proper authorization. "I was told these were personal items that the Queen Consort should have as mementos," Agnes confided to her union representative. "No one told me that what we were doing was improper or unauthorized. Now I'm hearing whispers that there's been some kind of investigation, and I'm worried about my job and my reputation." The union representative, Marcus Thornton, was a seasoned negotiator who understood the implications of what Agnes was describing. If palace staff members had been unknowingly involved in the improper transfer of royal artifacts, they could potentially face criminal charges unless the palace took steps to protect them. Thornton requested a meeting with palace management to discuss the concerns of his members. This request reached Sir Anthony's office just as the Royal Collection Trust audit was gaining momentum, creating a perfect storm of potential exposure. Sir Anthony found himself fighting battles on multiple fronts. He needed to manage the insurance audit, address staff concerns about legal liability, and maintain the confidentiality of the original incident, all while ensuring that the royal family's reputation remained intact. The situation became even more complicated when investigative journalists began receiving anonymous tips about irregularities in the handling of Queen Elizabeth's personal effects following her death. While the tips were vague and didn't specifically mention the coronation robe, they suggested that items had been distributed to family members without proper documentation or legal authority. Rebecca Hartley, a respected royal correspondent for The Telegraph, received several such tips and began making discreet inquiries among her contacts within the palace. Her investigation was still in its early stages, but Sir Anthony's intelligence network warned him that media interest was growing. The pressure reached a breaking point when Mrs. Fitzpatrick's preliminary findings were leaked to a member of Parliament who had been critical of royal spending. The MP, David Morrison, no relation to Sergeant Morrison, used parliamentary privilege to raise questions about the apparent mismanagement of priceless royal artifacts during a debate about funding for royal estates. Although Morrison's parliamentary questions were carefully worded to avoid specific accusations, they generated enough media attention to prompt other journalists to begin investigating the story. The palace press office found itself fielding increasingly specific questions about the coronation robe's recent conservation work. Sir Anthony realized that the careful cover-up was beyond salvage. The convergence of the insurance audit, staff concerns, and media interest had created a situation where the truth would inevitably emerge. The question was no longer whether the story would become public, but how much control the palace could maintain over the narrative when it did. He scheduled an emergency meeting with King Charles to discuss their limited options. The meeting took place at Balmoral, where the king had retreated to consider the escalating crisis in private. Sir Anthony presented the king with a stark assessment of their situation. "Your Majesty, we are facing a choice between a controlled disclosure that we manage ourselves and an uncontrolled exposure that could be far more damaging to the monarchy's reputation," Sir Anthony explained. "The audit trail is too extensive and involves too many people for us to continue maintaining the current narrative." King Charles listened grimly as Sir Anthony outlined the various investigations and inquiries that were converging on their secret. The king understood that his attempt to protect his wife from embarrassment had instead created a much larger crisis that now threatened the institution he had sworn to preserve. "What do you recommend, Anthony?" the king asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Your Majesty, I believe we need to prepare a controlled disclosure that acknowledges mistakes were made in handling the transfer of personal items following Queen Elizabeth's death, while emphasizing the innocent motivations involved. We should also announce new protocols to prevent such situations in the future." The king spent 2 sleepless nights at Balmoral considering his options. He consulted privately with a few trusted advisors, including his personal lawyer and a former cabinet secretary who specialized in crisis management. All of their advice pointed in the same direction. The palace needed to get ahead of the story before it exploded in an uncontrolled manner. The decision was made to prepare a comprehensive statement that would acknowledge the irregularities while framing them as honest mistakes made during a period of grief and transition. However, before this statement could be released, events overtook the palace's carefully laid plans. Mrs. Fitzpatrick, frustrated by what she perceived as stonewalling from the Royal Collection Trust, decided to expand her investigation beyond the coronation robe. Her broader audit revealed similar discrepancies in the documentation for several other precious items, including pieces of Queen Elizabeth's personal jewelry and signed photographs. The pattern of irregularities was too obvious to ignore, and Mrs. Fitzpatrick felt professionally obligated to report her findings to the authorities responsible for overseeing the Royal Collection Trust. Her detailed report landed on the desk of the National Audit Office, the independent body responsible for auditing public spending and institutional governance. The National Audit Office's involvement transformed what had been a private family matter into a potential public accountability issue. The office had the authority and responsibility to investigate any irregularities in the management of publicly funded royal collections, regardless of the royal family's preferences for privacy. Sir Anthony received notification of the National Audit Office's involvement on a Thursday morning while reviewing palace security protocols with Chief Henderson. The irony was not lost on either of them that Henderson's original investigation, conducted to protect the monarchy's security and reputation, had ultimately led to exactly the kind of public scrutiny they had hoped to avoid. "Sir Anthony," Henderson said as they reviewed the notification, "we may need to consider the possibility that someone else was aware of these irregularities and deliberately triggered this cascade of investigations. Sir Anthony had been considering the same possibility. The timing and coordination of the various investigations suggested that someone with knowledge of the original incident might be orchestrating the exposure for their own purposes. However, identifying such a person would require an investigation that could further expose the palace to unwanted scrutiny. As the fourth week of the unraveling crisis drew to a close, Sir Anthony faced the reality that the palace's ability to control the narrative was rapidly disappearing. The involvement of parliamentary questions, insurance auditors, union representatives, journalists, and now the National Audit Office had created a web of investigations that no amount of royal discretion could contain. The Coronation Robe incident, which had begun as a private family matter involving grief and sentiment, was evolving into a public crisis that would test the monarchy's ability to maintain public trust and confidence. Sir Anthony knew that the coming weeks would determine whether the House of Windsor could weather this storm or whether the discovery in Camilla's wardrobe would become a defining scandal of King Charles's reign. The careful world of royal protocol and discretion was about to collide with the harsh reality of public accountability, and Sir Anthony feared that the monarchy might never be quite the same again. The crisis reached its inevitable climax on a gray November morning when Rebecca Hartley of The Telegraph received a detailed dossier containing photographs, documentation, and testimonies that revealed the complete story of the Coronation Robe's discovery. The dossier had been delivered anonymously to her office, but its contents were so thoroughly researched and professionally compiled that Rebecca knew she was dealing with someone who had intimate access to the highest levels of the palace hierarchy. The photographs showed the Coronation Robe hanging in Queen Consort Camilla's wardrobe, taken from angles that only someone with authorized access could have achieved. The documentation included internal memos, security reports, and audit findings that painted a complete picture of the incident and the subsequent cover-up attempts. Most damaging of all, the dossier contained detailed timelines showing exactly when various officials had become aware of the situation and what steps they had taken to conceal it. Rebecca spent 18 hours verifying the authenticity of the materials and confirming details with her network of palace contacts. When she was satisfied that the story was accurate and properly sourced, she contacted the palace press office to request comment on what she knew would be one of the most explosive royal stories in decades. Sir Anthony received word of Rebecca's impending story at 6 o'clock that evening, giving the palace less than 12 hours before publication to formulate their response. The months of careful crisis management and controlled disclosure plans were rendered meaningless by the comprehensive nature of the leaked information. "Your Majesty," Sir Anthony said during an emergency phone call to King Charles, "the story is going to be published tomorrow morning, and we have no ability to influence its content or timing. Our only option now is to respond with complete transparency and hope that honesty serves us better than any further attempts at damage control." The king's response was immediate and decisive. "Anthony, I want a full statement prepared acknowledging everything that occurred. No more cover-ups, no more careful wording. The British people deserve the truth, and they deserve it from us directly." That night, as palace staff worked frantically to prepare a comprehensive response, Sir Anthony reflected on how completely their situation had deteriorated. The careful balance between protecting the royal family's privacy and maintaining institutional integrity had collapsed entirely, leaving them with no choice but full disclosure. The Telegraph story, published at 6 o'clock the following morning, revealed every detail of the scandal with devastating precision. Under the headline, "Queen's Coronation Robe Found Hidden in Camilla's Wardrobe," Rebecca Hartley's article exposed the unauthorized transfer of sacred royal regalia, the subsequent investigation, and the elaborate attempts to conceal what had occurred. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media exploded with outrage about the improper handling of Queen Elizabeth's coronation robe, with many commenters expressing feelings of betrayal that such a sacred artifact had been treated so carelessly. The hashtag #CoronationGate began trending within hours, as the public demanded answers about how such a breach of protocol could have occurred. Parliamentary opposition leaders seized on the story as evidence of royal entitlement and disregard for proper procedures. Shadow ministers called for immediate investigations into the governance of royal collections and questioned whether the monarchy could be trusted to properly safeguard the nation's heritage. However, the public reaction was more nuanced than the initial outrage suggested. As the full details of the story emerged, including the emotional context of Camilla's grief following Queen Elizabeth's death and her genuine remorse when the situation was discovered, public opinion began to shift toward a more sympathetic understanding. Opinion polls conducted in the days following the revelation showed that while a majority of Britons disapproved of the improper transfer of the coronation robe, most also believed that Camilla's actions had been motivated by love and respect rather than any malicious intent. The fact that the robe had been returned to its proper place and that new security protocols had been implemented also helped moderate the public's response. King Charles's decision to issue a full and honest statement proved to be crucial in managing the crisis. Rather than offering excuses or minimizing what had occurred, the king's statement acknowledged that serious mistakes were made in the handling of precious royal artifacts during a period of profound grief and transition. The statement continued, while the motivations involved were entirely innocent and stemmed from a desire to honor my mother's memory, this does not excuse the fact that proper protocols were not followed. I take full responsibility for these failures and for the subsequent attempts to handle this matter privately rather than with the transparency that the British people deserve. The King's statement also announced a comprehensive review of all procedures governing royal collections, to be conducted by an independent panel of experts in museum management and governmental oversight. This review would examine not only security protocols, but also the decision-making processes that had allowed the unauthorized transfers to occur. Queen Consort Camilla issued her own statement, expressing her deep regret and profound embarrassment at the situation her actions had created. I never intended to cause any harm to the institutions that my husband and I serve, her statement read. My love and respect for Queen Elizabeth II led me to make decisions that, while emotionally understandable, were institutionally inappropriate. The most surprising development came when Sergeant Morrison, whose original discovery had triggered the entire crisis, requested permission to make a public statement. Morrison felt that his role in uncovering the situation had been mischaracterized in some media coverage, and he wanted to clarify that his actions had been motivated entirely by his duty to protect royal security. I discovered the coronation robe while conducting routine security procedures, Morrison's statement explained. My immediate report to my superiors was motivated by my understanding that the security and proper care of royal artifacts is fundamental to my responsibilities as a royal guard. I have never regretted performing my duty, even though it led to difficult consequences for people I respect. Morrison's statement was significant because it demonstrated that the discovery had been the result of proper security procedures rather than any deliberate investigation into wrongdoing. This helped establish that the palace security system had actually worked as intended, even though the initial response to the discovery had been problematic. The independent review commissioned by the King was led by Dame Patricia Hodgson, former chairman of the BBC Trust and an expert in institutional governance. Dame Patricia's team included museum directors, legal experts, and former senior civil servants with experience in managing public heritage collections. Dame Patricia's investigation, conducted over 6 months with full access to palace records and personnel, revealed a complex picture of institutional weakness and personal grief intersecting in ways that had created the perfect conditions for the crisis to occur. The review found that the protocols governing royal collections had not been updated adequately to account for the transition from Queen Elizabeth II to King Charles III. The emotional turmoil following the Queen's death had created an environment where normal procedures were relaxed, and staff members had been reluctant to challenge requests that seemed to come from positions of authority. Most significantly, the review revealed that the problems extended beyond the coronation robe incident. Several other valuable items from Queen Elizabeth's personal collection had been transferred improperly, though none as significant as the coronation robe itself. The review's findings suggested systemic weaknesses rather than isolated incidents. Dame Patricia's final report, published 8 months after the scandal broke, made 47 specific recommendations for improving the governance of royal collections. These included establishing clear legal frameworks for the transfer of royal property, implementing independent oversight of all collection management decisions, and creating transparent public reporting mechanisms for the care and location of the most significant artifacts. The report also recommended that a new position be created, Curator of Royal Heritage, an independent professional who would report directly to Parliament rather than to the royal household. This official would be responsible for ensuring that the nation's royal heritage was properly protected regardless of family dynamics or institutional pressures. The implementation of Dame Patricia's recommendations represented the most significant reform of royal collection management in centuries. The changes fundamentally altered the relationship between the monarchy as a family and the crown as an institution, establishing clear boundaries that would prevent future incidents of the type that had caused the Coronation Robe scandal. For the individuals involved in the original incident, the consequences were mixed. Sir Anthony Hartwell retired early, accepting responsibility for the failed cover-up attempt. Chief Henderson received a formal reprimand, but remained in her position, with her reputation ultimately enhanced by her professional handling of the investigation. Sergeant Morrison was promoted to Chief Sergeant and became something of a folk hero among palace security staff for his unwavering commitment to duty. His discovery of the robe, while initially traumatic for all involved, was ultimately recognized as an example of the security system working properly. Queen Consort Camilla faced the most difficult consequences, enduring months of negative media coverage and public criticism. However, her genuine remorse and commitment to implementing reforms eventually helped restore much of her public standing. She became a vocal advocate for the new oversight mechanisms, using her experience to ensure that other family members understood the importance of following proper procedures. King Charles emerged from the crisis with his reputation largely intact, primarily because of his decision to respond with complete honesty once the story became public. His willingness to accept responsibility and implement meaningful reforms was seen by many as evidence of his commitment to modern, accountable monarchy. The Coronation Robe itself was subjected to the most thorough conservation assessment in its history, ensuring that its temporary residence in an uncontrolled environment had not caused any damage. The robe was subsequently displayed in a special exhibition at the Tower of London, with detailed information about its history and significance that attracted record numbers of visitors. The scandal, which had begun with Sergeant Morrison's routine security check, ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the institutions designed to protect Britain's royal heritage. The transparency forced by the crisis created new accountability mechanisms that increased public confidence in the management of royal collections. As the dust settled on what became known as the Coronation Robe affair, most observers agreed that the monarchy had survived its most serious constitutional challenge in decades. The crisis had tested the institution's ability to adapt and reform, and the royal family's willingness to accept accountability for their mistakes. The lasting legacy of the incident was not the scandal itself, but the reforms it had inspired. The new governance structures for royal collections became a model for other nations with royal heritage, and the transparency requirements helped restore public confidence in the monarchy's stewardship of national treasures. Years later, when historians assessed the early years of King Charles III's reign, the Coronation Robe incident was seen as a defining moment when the monarchy chose transparency over secrecy, accountability over privilege, and institutional integrity over family convenience. What had begun as a potential disaster became, ultimately, a demonstration of the monarchy's ability to learn, adapt, and serve the British people with renewed dedication to proper governance. The truth had indeed emerged, but it had done so in a way that ultimately strengthened rather than destroyed the institution it had initially threatened to undermine.